I'd like to first start by thanking the organizers of this event, the Trace Institute, and the Noonautics Research Organization as well, and all the leadership and the production teams involved in that. And I'd like to thank all of you, as well as the online audience as well. So I'm going to start with a little intro to get the topic going. So in the history of humankind, shamans of indigenous cultures have accessed to altered states of reality with the help of endogenous substances, natural substances, and they've been able to explore those spaces and bring back insights to their tribes. So more recently, science has discovered that a particular molecule, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, is one of the mediators of these remarkable experiences. And a new generation of explorers has been able to go into this space and to get new insights where they encounter kaleidoscopic geometries and intelligent and autonomous entities. Now, modern science says that these are just merely hallucinations, that they're not worthy of our study because they're just chaotic brain activities. But a small proportion of scientists are now pushing back, saying, not so fast. We need to study this, and if we're going to do it, we should study it with mathematical precision and scientific rigor. And so today, we're very honored to have two leaders of that movement with us to discuss this issue. So we are starting here with, on the far side, Dr. Donald Hoffman, who is Professor Emeritus of UC Irvine, and also co-founder and scientific director of the Trace Institute. And he's an author of the book, The Case Against Reality. Then next to me, we have Dr. Andrew Gallimore, who is a neuroscientist and computational pharmacologist affiliated with the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. Andrew is he's a co-director of Noonautics, and he's an author of the book, The Death by Astonishment. So thank you both for being with us today. Right. Okay, so we're going to begin the session by, I'd like to start with you, Don, if possible. Don has been developing theories of reality and of consciousness over many years, since the dawn of history, actually. And we'd like to start with your origin story. So how did you first come to this space where before you developed the theories of conscious realism and interface theory of perception, the trace logic, and so on? What was the origin that kind of motivated that journey for you?
Well, for me, it started off, my dad was a minister in a fundamentalist Christian church, and so I got one story about the world on Sundays, and then in my science classes, I got a completely different story. And so by the time I was in my teens, I decided I needed to figure it out for myself. And so I decided the best way to do that would be to ask a particular question, and my question was, are we just machines? Are people just machines? Nice, clean, technical question. And I decided the best way to do that is to study psychology and neuroscience on the one side, and then study artificial intelligence. And so I ended up at MIT in the AI lab, so I was working on AI, and then also in the brain and cognitive science department there, so I was looking at human neuroscience. So I was looking at both camps and trying to figure out what could machines do and what could they not do, and it was then trying to get a mathematical model of that led me to then ask, okay, what do we really mean by observation? And so I began to develop a mathematical model of observation, and eventually ended up being the notion of conscious agents that we're working on now in the Trace Institute. So I've been working on it since my teenage years. Yeah.
Don, could you say a bit more about the lack of an observer in our current models of science and why that's a problem?
Yes. The notion of observer, even if you aren't interested in consciousness, the notion of observer is very important in science. All of our data come from observations. The reason why we think science is objective is because different observers compare data and see if they agree. So we have communication between observers. So observation and careful observation is the foundation of science. And what's remarkable is we do not have a generally accepted model of observation in science right now. That's a really remarkable fact. In Newton's theories, we didn't need one. The observer didn't affect things. In Einstein, we talked about observers because there are clocks and that changes and so forth, but we really didn't get a model of the observer there. And in quantum mechanics, all of a sudden, the observer became front and center with the measurement problem, which is now a century old, and there's no universally accepted solution to it. It's a big, big mess. So here we are, science, our best way to understand the world based on observers, has no theory of the observer. And what we're doing right now in science is trying to shoehorn the observer into space-time. So use some kind of quantum description of observers or some kind of physical description of observers, or observers emerging from physical systems. But our best science is telling us that space-time is not fundamental. We have to go outside of space-time. So already we're going outside of space-time. The European Research Council has a big 10 million euro initiative about finding structures entirely outside of space-time. So if we're trying to shoehorn observers into space-time, we're ignoring what our best science is telling us. And so what the Trace Institute is trying to do is say, look, let's get a mathematical model of observers, qua observers, not shoehorned into space-time. And let's go the other way around. With our model of observers, let's see if we can build space-time and quantum mechanics and relativity theory from observers. And so that's the goal. But whether you believe in consciousness or not, the goal of having a mathematical model of observers and booting up science with that model is critical for anybody who believes or doesn't believe in consciousness. I am thinking about it in terms of conscious terms, but the mathematics doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you. Let's come at this from the other angle. Andrew, you've been researching DMT for over 20 years. What has inspired you on this path?
Well, I mean, kind of like Don, I became interested in altered states of consciousness when I was a teenager, particularly psychedelics, and I learned about this molecule. I still remember a friend one morning when I was at school, and I was like 15, 16 years old. He brought this magazine and he said, I have this, I think you'll be interested in this in this article on the back. And on the back was this photo of this bearded fellow called Terence McKenna. And it was an interview with Terence McKenna. And one of the later questions in the interview was, tell us about your favorite drug. And Terence McKenna started talking about this thing called DMT, which I had no idea what this meant. I went to the public library and I got the answer, dimethyl terephthalate, which is a type of plastic. So that was, I didn't try to smoke that, fortunately. But this was, I'm showing my age a little bit, but this was the dawn of the internet. So it wasn't easy. There was only one internet in the school, and you had to get a password from a man in a white coat to actually access it. But I did access it. I was the only person in the school, I think, that ever accessed that bloody internet, and I was there all the time, trying to find out as much as I could about this seemingly miraculous molecule called DMT that would apparently transport you from the normal waking world into one that bore no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world, and a world that was infinitely more complex and dynamical and strange geometries and topologies, and a populated world, a world that was filled with beings with whom you could interact and communicate, beings that were not human, they were not animal, they were entirely other, entirely alien. And this seemed to me just remarkable. It's like, if this is true, did I really believe it? Maybe not. But I decided at that point, I dropped all the subjects I was studying, and I said, okay, I need to study this now. I picked up chemistry and biology and mathematics, thought, right, this is, my future now is going to be studying how these molecules interface with the human brain to generate these remarkable effects on human experience, on human consciousness. And so the trajectory, if you like, of my life since that period, like 30 years ago now, has been towards trying to understand DMT, which I finally was able to experience a few years later, thinking that I'd read all the Terence McKenna books and listened to all of his lectures, and I kind of knew what I was getting into, or at least I thought I did. And I was completely lost. I was at sea. I was completely confounded by this experience. It was, as Terence McKenna says, it was un-Englishable. It was impossible. It was not possible for this experience to have occurred to me, and yet it did. And I knew, that kind of completely cemented my trajectory, that I wasn't just going to focus on psychedelics, but I was going to focus on DMT. I really wanted to understand how this molecule achieved its effects, and whether we really are interacting with some kind of intelligent other. To give it the most neutral term, intelligent agent is a term I used in more recent years, and I don't think I'm there in being able to explain DMT, but I think I've made some progress in telling people what DMT is not. Most of my time is trying to convince people, as Charles said, that this is not mere hallucination. This is not simply the brain on drugs, man. This is not merely neural noise, or choose your term. The neuroscientists will pick what was that one I heard before? Illusory social events is my favorite term for entity interactions. I always say if that's a social event, I'd like to see the kind of parties that neuroscientists frequents, because they're not quite like the social events I'm familiar with. And I still think that DMT represents a true mystery. I think it is something that science cannot easily explain. And I think we do need to take seriously, as we are doing today, I think, the possibility that we are indeed interacting with some kind of intelligent agent, some kind of conscious agent. And so here we are.
Thank you, Andrew. So on one hand, we have a cognitive scientist and mathematician. On the other hand, we have a pharmacologist and neurobiologist. It's not an obvious or intuitive kind of connection between those fields, those threads of research. I'd like to ask this to both of you, but how did you first engage and learn about each other's work, and what did it inspire or make you think of? Either of you can.
Well, I'm gonna start because Don has been around a lot longer than me. Well, slightly longer. And people always say to me, have been for a long time, have you ever heard of Donald Hoffman? I think his work would really, resonate with yours. And I have to say to him, I was reading Don Hoffman's work, when you were at your mother's teat. I've been inspired by Don's work and have referenced Don's work throughout my work, from my earliest writings on DMT. 15, 16 years ago, I was referencing Don's work because although people often accuse me of being a materialist or even a reductionist, I don't think people quite understand what that word means when they accuse me of that. There's nothing about what I say that is reductionist, but actually at heart I am an idealist. I believe that consciousness is fundamental. I believe the placing the material at the ground of reality, assuming the ontological primacy, if you like, of the material, was the grandest of missteps in the history of science, and trying to boot up, to use Don's terminology, to kind of boot up consciousness from the material has failed. And scientists have had literally centuries to make it work. And yet I don't even see any scientists who have an idea how that problem might be solved. And many are now kind of throwing their hands up and copping out. I saw a post by I think it was Steven Pinker or Michael Shermer recently, who said, consciousness is ultimately unknowable. So like, what do we do with that then? It's like, we can't explain it. None of them ever questioned and thought, well, maybe this assumption that maybe the one thing that we cannot deny, our own subjective consciousness, We can deny everything else, right? Descartes showed that. We can deny the material. We can deny everything. We can't deny our own subjective consciousness. Maybe that is fundamental. Maybe it's not this material world that appears within consciousness that is fundamental. But of course, they can't accept that. They're too invested in that position. So whilst I do spend, I work at the kind of the neural level. I work kind of at the brain level most of the time, and I avoid the question of consciousness simply because I can get my teeth into the mechanics of the brain. But ultimately, I've always felt that consciousness is fundamental, and then in some way this thing we call the brain, this thing we call the physical world, this thing we call reality is fundamentally consciousness. But the problem was, until now, is that I didn't really trying to understand the mechanics of that. What I think Don's work does now is says, okay, reality is not just consciousness and that's it, but actually we can do things with that. We can describe the mathematics, we can describe the mechanics and the dynamics. We can actually do real science with that basic premise. Am I right, Don?
Absolutely. And my path has been very, very different. It's for me, I've never even smoked a cigarette, so I'm just a completely different kind of person. But
I have some nicotine here.
Yeah, so I was just trying to understand mathematically what is the best model that I could have of human perception. And I still remember in the late 80s when the mathematics told me that everything I'm seeing, I'm making it up. I'm creating what I see. And I didn't come into it expecting that answer. And when I looked at the mathematics that we were developing, this was with Chetan Prakash and Bruce Bennett, two great mathematicians. When I really understood what the math was saying, I still remember the moment where I realized it and I had to sit down. It was just so stunning to me. So I was not trying to get to this point of view. I was just trying to understand visual perception. And when that came out, it stunned me. Then when it came out later on with what we're doing now, the recursive trace logic and the work with Andrew, again, I have no experience in this space. So, I can read the descriptions, I can try to imagine what it's like, disembodied cognitions and so forth. But just now in the last 3 months, studying the mathematics of the recursive trace logic I've gotten a slap in the face. And the mathematics tells me that disembodied cognition is the norm, and the kinds of embodied cognition that we have is the training wheels version of what's possible. And again, I just realized that in the last few weeks. So I'm still reeling. So I'm not like an advocate of this stuff. I'm reluctant, reluctantly being pushed to it by the mathematics, but I want to go wherever the mathematics tells me to go. And with agents like this, again, I'm a complete hard-nosed scientist. If they're real, we can do hard-nosed experiments and show it, and if they're not real, we'll find that out as well. So for me, it's just follow the math, follow careful experiments, and we'll see where it leads.
Yeah, I think the fundamental structure within Don's conscious realism is the conscious agent. And I, from the perspective of DMT, if you want to see agents, then smoke some fucking DMT, because you're going to see some agents, right? And I've been calling them intelligent agents for a while. To give them the most neutral term, I try to avoid things like spirits or gods or aliens as much as possible, and just refer to them in the most neutral way possible, which I describe as intelligent agents that seem to be conscious. And so straight away, before you even get to the mathematics, you can see where this Don's ideas and my ideas start to intersect. And as it turns out, as we'll get to, they intersected much. The intersection was much bigger than I could have anticipated.
Thank you. Don, from your perspective, when you first connected with Andrew, what did you think about the potential of applying the trace logic and other models to the DMT space?
It seemed to me like there was a lot of potential. Here was a real empirical direction we could pursue. And the reports are of people experiencing things not just in 3 dimensions, but in more dimensions, 4 or 5 dimensions, even more. People saying there are way too many dimensions, and what do you do with that? But I've been studying how do we. One of the things I've worked on in normal human vision is how we take a 2-dimensional image at the eye. Your retina has got only 2 dimensions. It's essentially a flat surface that's slightly curved. So anytime you see in 3 dimensions, you're hallucinating the 3rd dimension. So right now, the depth that you see is not directly there at your eye. The eye has a flat image. You're projecting out a 3D model. And so many of the papers I've worked on with mathematicians is how do we mathematically take a 2-dimensional image or a sequence of images and accurately create a 3-dimensional representation of the world. Well, so we can do that, and it matches human vision quite well. But then you can ask the same question, could you do that and go to 4 dimensions or 5 dimensions? And so a friend of mine, Mike Desmura, has worked on this, and the answer is yes. And he's then been doing experiments with people in 4-dimensional virtual worlds and seeing if we could get 4-dimensional perceptions and so forth. And he seems to have some evidence that that's possible, that we could sort of train ourselves up. So Andrew's stuff then starts to make sense to me that, okay, these people are going in not just 4 dimensions. Who knows? DMT might be taking you into 50 dimensions. I don't know what it is, and colors that we've never seen before, and other exotic experiences that we've never had before. And again, I'm the reluctant scientist who's being forced, kicking and screaming by the math to say, yes, we can go here, so I better go here, because I would be a bad scientist if I didn't at least explore.
And Andrew, on your side, given the background with DMT phenomenology, how did Don's theories help inspire you, or what specifically were you hoping to achieve by collaborating?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, when Don started talking about the trace logic kind of recently, as I said, I've been following his work for many years, but there was something he said during one of the first interviews I saw him with, and he said that it's implicit within this model, within this trace logic model, that there are effectively an unbounded, right, a practically, possibly infinite number of conscious agents that reality is composed of. Reality is composed of and only of conscious agents that interact with each other. And there's an unbounded number of these, the vast majority of which are imperceptible to us. And they're not only imperceptible, but they are literally unimaginable to us. We only have access to this very, very thin, infinitesimally, basically thin slice of this conscious agent network that we interact with. And so that naturally makes you think, well, when I take DMT, or when someone takes DMT, they start seeing beings that are unfathomably strange, that are not just exotic or unusual, but that are impossible, that have no relationship, there's no referent in the normal waking world for these kind of quite obviously agentic beings, incredibly strange beings that seem to occupy and manipulate an entirely different kind of experiential manifold, shall we say. They don't occupy this world. They seem to live within and manipulate an entirely different type of world. And so that initially I was thinking, well, it sounds like there's something there. Maybe what DMT is doing is somehow, this was just intuitive. It was this way before we actually started getting into the mathematics, before I even started working with Don. It made sense that perhaps DMT was allowing us to interact in some way, in new ways, with the conscious agent network, opening up new modes of interaction. Because I had a problem, in my previous work, I hope was able to kind of dispel the idea that the DMT experience could be simply explained away as hallucination. And I always felt, and I've always said, that it seems like the DMT is gating access to some alternate source of information. I don't think you're going anywhere as such under the influence of DMT, but there is some change in your world that allows you to receive, you might call it an alternate source of sensory inputs, that allowed your brain to effectively construct this alternate reality within which these beings were, that were populated by these beings. But the problem I had is I had no way to really explain that within the physicalist model. What is this alternate source of sensory information? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from another world, another dimension? I didn't have the mechanics. There's no mechanics, really. Some people try to invoke, maybe it's going at the quantum level, maybe it's subquantum, something like this. But really, there's no simple way to explain within the physicalist model how that information is gated into the brain. But what Don's model does is allows you to get to the very, very ground of reality itself, and actually look at how do these conscious agents interact? How does one conscious agent perceive another conscious agent? What is the mechanism of that perceptual process? And once you start looking at it from that perspective, then as we will get to, it all falls into place in ways that I couldn't have imagined, and then it was actually quite shocking to me.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So let's get a little bit deeper into the math, and I'd like Don to take us there. Don, the interface theory, perception, the trace logic, and the recursive trace logic all play fundamental roles in this this project. But particularly, I'd like to ask if you could help define us the notion of the interface and the notion of a trace, which seem to be relevant, to this discussion here. Could you talk a bit about those concepts and how they might apply to the DMT space?
Right. So most of us think of space-time as the fundamental reality, and from within this point of view, space-time is just a virtual reality headset. So that's the difference. We're thinking about space-time as not an objective reality; it's a virtual reality headset, and what's really going on is there are a bunch of conscious agents interacting. There's an infinite number of them, as Andrew was saying, and so we have to sort of tame that infinity. How do we interact with an infinite number of agents? Well, you sort of dumb things down, and that's what our space-time headset is. It's a way of interacting with other agents without getting overwhelmed. And so when you start looking at the mathematics of how many kinds of headsets could there be, and how could they vary, and so forth, you realize there's a whole range of headsets that could possibly be out there, and ours is, when you look at the possibilities, ours is one of the more trivial. We actually have one of the dumbest headsets you could possibly have, and the most restrictive. But then you can start to ask, okay, so what are these other possibilities, and how could we go from our headset to other headsets that are a little bit more open and so forth? And we can go at this in a couple ways with the mathematics, trying to actually abstractly think about how to build them. Also the neuroscience, we can actually look at how the brain works. But from this point of view, what we're doing in neuroscience now is we're not thinking of the brain as creating what we see. The brain is just another symbol in the headset. So symbols and headsets only exist when you render them. So if I'm in a VR game and I'm playing Grand Theft Auto and I see a car, a Ferrari, the Ferrari is not real. It's only there when I see it, and as soon as I look away, the Ferrari is gone. So I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm telling you I don't have any neurons right now. If you looked, you would see neurons, but that's because you rendered the neurons. I don't have neurons right now. So what's going on is we have to look at the brain as our render on the fly of how the headset is built. We have to take neuroscience and reverse engineer it. So the brain is our best representation. It's the headset representation of how the headset itself is engineered. So that's why I really want to study the neuroscience. It's the best clue we have as to how our headset is engineered. But one thing I expect to happen is that we'll see that there are certain parameters that we can fix. We have 3 dimensions of space that we see. All we need is to change one number, and now that's 4 in terms of a design. So how do we change that number? Does DMT, for example, do something as simple, maybe one of many things? Maybe it changes 3 to 5 or 10 or something like that, and all of a sudden it's opening up. So if you think about a headset as something that's just a piece of software that agents use to interact with each other, then it's perfectly open to the possibility that DMT somehow gives us a way of switching between headsets, upgrading our headset. So I'm not saying that we know that. I'm just saying the mathematics allows this possibility, and so we need to actually explore it. So that's where I'm very interested in the mathematics seems really quite open to this kind of thing. It's going to be, as you can see, quite complicated. Even the headset representation of the brain, there's 86 billion neurons, there's trillions of synapses. Even the dumbed down version is not that easy. So whatever's going on beyond the headset is going to be very, very difficult. But that's what we're after here, is to try to really understand how the headset is engineered, and then to understand what DMT might be doing to the details of that engineered headset.
Okay. And Andrew, let's look at this from the DMT phenomenology standpoint. We just postulate an thought experiment. There's a conscious agent A who's outside the headset, and then a conscious agent B who is in the DMT headset, or perhaps even in a conscious reality space. How would an agent that was outside the headset look like to an agent inside, and how would that relate to the DMT experience and the entities? So it's kind of a thought-provoking experiment.
Yeah, I will say, oh, is that okay? Yeah, I will say that Don is very, very good at Grand Theft Auto. Absolutely ruthless. It's a bloodbath. But yeah, so when we started working with Don, and I should mention Niffer Hermansen, the very talented mathematician who worked with me, because the mathematics is very complicated, to say the least, and easy to get wrong. So I'm looking at Niffer's face to see if he winces when I say anything about the mathematics. But hopefully I can get it right. So when we started working together, my question was, okay, if we live within, we occupy, or we interact with this very, very thin slice of the conscious agent network, what are the limits there? Why? First of all, what's actually going on in terms of what agents we can perceive, what agents we can't perceive, because the vast majority we can't perceive at all. They're completely imperceptible. Why is that? And if we can understand that, then maybe we can think about, well, how can we perturb that system? How can we perturb the interface such that normally imperceptible conscious agents become perceptible? We weren't even really thinking about DMT at this point, although it was in the back of our minds, of course, but really we were just probing the model, basically, probing Don's conscious realism trace logic model and trying to find conditions whereby normally imperceptible conscious agents become perceptible. Now, way back, about 6 years ago, I wrote my second book, Reality Switch Technologies, in which I describe a concept I developed called the world space. So I see the brain as kind of a world builder. The world that you experience, which Don would call the interface, is constructed by the brain, in the way I was thinking about it. And if you think about all the possible worlds that your brain can construct, all possible moments, you get this vast state space, which I called the world space. But we only occupy in normal waking consciousness this very, very small region of the world space, which I call the consensus reality space. You see it like a well within, like an attractor basin within this world space landscape. And what DMT does is it pushes you out. It perturbs the brain and pushes you out of the consensus reality space into entirely different regions of the world space. You might call that the DMT space, this set of states that represent the structure and dynamics of the DMT world. Now, what I didn't have, I can kind of explain within that model how we go from the normal waking world into this alternate world. But what I didn't have was any way to think about how this altered world might actually be interacting. You might actually be interacting with other beings, other conscious agents or intelligent agents within that. But then I started working with Niffer and Don, and we kind of independently kind of arrived at the same position, but from within the conscious realism framework. So in conscious realism, Don doesn't call it the world space, he calls it the experience space. So the set of all the states that a conscious agent could possibly occupy. This vast, effectively infinite, really, number of states that a conscious agent can occupy. But again, we only, that experience space is just a set of states. It's basically a very, very, very long list of possible states that a conscious agent can occupy, can experience. But sitting on top of this experience space, and this is key, is this mathematical structure called the qualia kernel. Right? It's a for the more mathematically sophisticated, it's a Markov kernel. But for those that aren't mathematically sophisticated, people like me, it's a mathematical structure that gives the dynamics. You know, how does a conscious agent move between the different states of the experience space? You know, if you're in this state, what's the probability that you're going to move to this state or this state or this state? So that gives you the dynamics. So you have the experience space is simply the set of states, and the qualia kernel gives it structure. And the qualia kernel, in the same way that the kind of neural connectivity, as I described it, restricts you to this very limited region of the world space that I call the consensus reality space, the qualia kernel is restricting you to a very, very limited region of the experience space. So you tend to move within states within this very, very small region. And in fact, we still called it the consensus reality space because that's kind of made sense. But what's beautiful, and this is where the real magic happened, is that the qualia kernel is actually composed of three other kernels, the decision, the action, and the perception kernel. And the perception kernel is key because it determines how an agent perceives, you know, how does it interact with the rest of the agent network. And so now we have this connection. Now we're able to not just talk about entering other types of experiences, but we're also able to talk about how that affects how you interact with the rest of the agent network. So when the brain is perturbed by DMT, what's actually happening is you're not just being pushed out of the consensus reality space into this entirely different region of the experience space, but the qualia kernel that sits on that region of the experience space is going to be completely different. The dynamics is going to be completely different. The way that you interact with the conscious agent network within that region of the experience space is going to be completely different. So conscious agents that were completely imperceptible, that evolution had filtered out, suddenly become perceptible. And even better than that is that you can actually, again, not even thinking about DMT, you could actually think to yourself, okay, what would that actually be like to be situated within this consensus reality, this space, this very limited region of the experience space, and then to be pushed out of it and find yourself in this entirely different region? What would that actually be like? Well, the geometry and the topology of the experience of your world would change dramatically. There's no reason to think that this 3+1 dimensional restriction that we get in the consensus reality space would apply outside of it. So it would likely be an entirely alien world that would be impossible. It wouldn't make any sense to you. It would be completely unlike any kind of experience you've had, any other kind of world. The beings that occupied that space as well, the intelligent beings, the other conscious agents or beings with which you interact with, would also be completely alien in ways that you could not have imagined or anticipated. In other words, almost the entirety of the phenomenology of the DMT experience, you know, that's DMT, right? Going to a world that is inordinately complex and extremely strange and geometrically and topologically different, occupied by beings that have no relationship to the beings that you normally interact with. That's DMT. And that basically, for want of a better term, fell out of the mathematics. And that to me, when that happened, that was a really deeply profound moment, because DMT suddenly went from being inexplicable to basically all making sense. The whole thing just fell out of Don's model. I could not have, for one moment, have anticipated that we would basically boot up the DMT phenomenology from this very abstract mathematics, and that's what we've been able to do. And I think it's it's a huge testament to the beauty, magnificence, dare I say, of Professor Hoffman's model, that we've been able to achieve that.
Thank you. Don, do you agree with Andrew? And do you have any further thoughts to add about the convergence of this model with the DMT space?
I agree that it fits like a glove to the phenomenology that Andrew's been exploring for many, many years. It's truly stunning. And it's one little way of thinking about what's going on here is, Andrew mentioned the Markov model, and there are the idea, this is, I mentioned earlier about observers, and the simplest model of an observer you can have is to say, well, an observer has certain possible outcomes. Maybe I see green or red or blue. So these are the outcomes of my possible experiences, and they can change. Maybe I see green now, then I see red next, and I see blue next. And so the simplest thing you can do is say, let's list all the possible observer outcomes for this observer and list how they change. And when you do that, you get a mathematical thing called a Markov model. And what we discovered, so Markov chains have been known since 1905, so they're not new. And the notion of a trace has been known for at least half a century. If I have a big Markov chain, say on 10 states, but you can only see 3 of the states, then the Markov chain on 10 states will induce a Markov chain on the 3 states that you can see. It will give you effectively the transitions that you're going to see if you can only see those 3 states. That's called a trace. There's a formula for it. It's been well known. But what we discovered in the Trace Institute research, and that hadn't been discovered before by mathematicians, is that trace relationship gives you a logic on all Markov chains. It gives you a logic on all possible observers. That had not been noticed. So that's why we call this the Trace Institute, because that trace logic is the logic of observation. And it's a logic of minimum surprise. So those who are interested in Carl Friston's work, and we're trying to minimize surprise and so forth, this is the logic of zero surprise. And so I've talked with Carl about this, and he agrees. So there's a very interesting connection with Carl Friston's work, but where he's trying to minimize free energy to try to approach minimum surprise, we compute it directly. The trace logic, you just get it directly by computation. And this is then also a logic of intelligence in the following sense. Not being surprised is a big part of being intelligent. If everything I do, I go to pick up this glass of water and it breaks, I go to tie my shoe and I fall on the floor, if everything I do I'm surprised, then I'm not very bright, right? And so having a logic that has the zero surprise logic is a logic of intelligence. So it's a logic of observation that turns out to be a logic of intelligence. And then when we go recursively, it gives us a logic of agency. Because if I'm looking through this one observer window, and maybe I want to change to a different observer window, a different size or a different set of outcomes that I could look through, I need to have a way of doing that. How do I transition from one window to another? It turns out you just have another Markov chain where you go from one window to another by Markov chain. So the lowest level is observers, but then you can go from one observer to another, so you get what we call a policy of moving around on observers, and it turns out it has its own trace logic, and then you can change policies. So you have a way of changing policies, and so you can see recursively, you just get one trace logic after another, and you build up the notion of agency to whatever level of sophistication you want. So it's unbelievably simple, but the ideas are very, very powerful. And when you go from one window to, say, a bigger window, one thing I'll just mention, just to give you a flavor for how you get these different phenomenologies. there's a counter that you have associated with each window. Every time you get a change in your experience, like red goes to green, green goes to blue, or whatever, you just up your counter by 1. Now think if you have a 10-state matrix, red, green, blue, all 10 of them, and then you can only see 3 of the states. The counter for the 3-state person is not going to go as fast as the counter for the 10-state, right? His counter is not going to go as. That will give us time dilation in special relativity. That's where it comes from. It's just that simple. And when you look at how you're going to actually take the structure of the matrices and start to get 3-dimensional shapes from them, once again you find that directly the 3-dimensional shapes will contract for the smaller windows than for the larger windows, and you'll get the space contraction of special relativity. So all right there in the structure of the trace logic itself, you're starting to see the outlines of special and general relativity. The trace logic, one of the things we're going to be doing in the next 2 years is to show mathematically we get it exactly. So no hand wave, we get Minkowski space from the trace, recursive trace, and we also get curved space-time, and we can get quantum field theory. That's what we have to do in the next 2 years. We want to just prove that we can get all of the current space-time physics exactly. Then we'll try to reverse engineer the headset. So we have to get space-time first. Then we can try to reverse engineer how is our headset built. And then once we do that, then the magic starts to happen, because once you know the software of the headset, you can do miracles, right? If you know the software of Grand Theft Auto, you can turn the wizard's Ferrari into a rocket ship or a donkey, whatever you want to do. So once you know the software, you can play beyond the wizard, and so that's where we're headed. So the technologies that are going to come out of this are mind-blowing, and we get a hint of it when we start doing DMT kinds of stuff, and we see these worlds that most people, when they look at them, they're going, that's not even possible. What these elves are showing us are things that you cannot do.
Elves
and there's
and,
too
elves
many.
And what?
Elves and what are these things? And they're just and apparently, I mean, again, I've not been there, but I haven't done this. But what I read is they're happy to show you that you're in the sandbox and they're in the real world, and so that's what I feel. The mathematics that we're working on says exactly we're in a little tiny sandbox, but the mathematics is pointing to a real world that's much, much bigger, and we can go there. And with DMT, we may actually be able to go there experientially. With the mathematics, we can go there scientifically.
Yeah, I think what Don is pointing to here clearly is that his model doesn't simply apply to this. It's not simply trying to explain 3+1 space-time, the way our physical world that we assume to be the only world that there is, how that all works, but actually reaches into an all-encompassing model of reality itself, and including the DMT worlds. And I think, going back to the idea of intelligence, what our model doesn't necessarily imply is that we often describe these beings as being extraordinarily intelligent, and I've done that many times. But working with Don's model, what I came to realize is that actually it's not like we're dealing with beings that are extraordinarily intelligent in the human sense. We're simply dealing with beings that occupy an entirely different experiential manifold. They occupy a higher dimensional space. What they do, they will often show you these impossible higher dimensional objects and say, look at this, as if they're teaching a toddler squares and triangles, right? Because in their world, it's as simple as that. They're not doing really, from their perspective, they aren't doing particularly complicated things. They just happen to occupy a space, a geometry, a topology that is far different to ours, and that is much richer, has entirely different Markovian dynamics, right? And so when people say, if they're so intelligent or whatever, why don't they give us the blueprint of the time machine? Why don't they know everything? Why? And that it's not that kind of intelligence I don't think we're dealing with. We're simply dealing with beings that are so different to us, that things that they do that are completely trivial from their perspective are mind-blowing to us. You know, Don often talks about this amplitudahedron, which is simply this high-dimensional object that exists outside of space-time, you know, and it's able to explain particle scattering that, from our perspective, you know, using Feynman diagrams and this kind of space-time modeling, you know, is pages and pages of symbols and equations, and yet the whole thing just falls out of this high-dimensional geometric object, and it's that kind of thing that we're dealing with. From our perspective, what they seem bewildering and incredible, simply because of the type of space that they occupy, and it allows our consciousness to occupy those kind of dynamics by removing that restriction that the qualia kernel has on our consciousness within the consensus reality space, and kicking us into this other region of the experience space where those rules no longer apply. We can start to represent dynamics and structures that that were simply beyond our representational reach. One of the reasons we don't see a lot of or the vast majority of these conscious agents, we don't perceive them in any way, is simply because we have no way to represent them. Those kind of dynamics simply cannot be represented by this very restricted dynamics of us as a conscious agent within this consensus reality space. Once you get out of that, those rules no longer apply, and then you can start interacting with and perceiving agents that were normally imperceptible.
Thank you. So before we get into some of the proposed experiments, I was wondering if one or both of you could, finally, I think we're ready, we're warmed up for the topic of this event, Traces of the Other, are DMT entities real? So there is an ontological debate about the existence of the entities versus hallucination. Maybe, Andrew, you could start us off by telling us what the nature of that debate is, and what is the key kind of differences, right, from mainstream science with others who want to keep an open mind about this.
Yeah, I think most scientists, certainly those the vast majority operating within the materialist paradigm, will say that the assumption is it's a hallucination, and our job is to show how and why it's a hallucination. How does the brain that evolved to construct this particular model of the environment, again returning to the brain perspective, our brain evolved. The conscious agent evolved to represent this very limited type of environment that was adaptive, that wasn't truthful, as Don always says, but is adaptive, that is useful, that allows us to interact adaptively and meaningfully and usefully with this conscious agent network. How is it that the brain suddenly becomes capable of constructing these entirely alien worlds in the presence of DMT? That's always been my argument, is this is not easy to explain why, when you perturb the brain, you don't just get random noise, you don't get dreamlike imagery, you get imagery that is staggeringly complex and yet also staggeringly coherent. Staggering narrative complexity. This is not just random noise. This is not your brain just making it up. There is something. Anyone who's taken DMT will know exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of it cannot be impressed upon you through this very limited medium of language, but you know it. You know that this is something else going on, and that's always. I've always tried to keep an open mind in that respect. I've never said I think machine elves are real, but I've always been careful not to dismiss the DMT experience. I don't think it can be explained. But as I said before, the problem I always had was is trying to explain how this information can be transmitted into the brain, and conscious realism kind of finally allows us to do that.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Don, what is your take on the question of, are DMT entities real?
So it's a very interesting question, and the experiments that we'll talk about are designed to be very hard-nosed and to try to distinguish between, are these just illusions created by the brain because it's messed up, or are we in contact with something that's a deeper and more interesting kind of reality? And so this raises a question about what does it mean for us in this trace logic approach to even think about how we interact with each other and what we see here. So for example, the question is big in science right now about what's the distinction between living and non-living things, or conscious and unconscious things. And from the point of view of the trace and the headset, everything that I'm seeing right now is something that I'm rendering on the fly, right? So all I'm seeing, I'm not seeing your consciousness directly, or I'm just seeing a body. I'm seeing a shape that I render. That's not you. And what you're seeing of me is just a Hoffman shape but that's not Hoffman. That's just what you can see. So we have these things that we're rendering on the fly when we look at people, or when I look at a rock, I'm rendering something on the fly. Now, they're all equally just renders in the headset. So in some sense, there's no distinction between a Hoffman avatar and a rock. They're both equally, they're there when you see them, and they disappear when you look away. So the question is, we have to go deeper on this question then. What does it mean to say, are these real entities or real agents or not? So the first thing I'll say is the distinction we make between living and non-living is not principled, according to this headset theory. That distinction is an artifact of the limitations of our headset. It's because our headset has to give up at some point. When I'm interacting with Andrew, my headset is giving me a symbol which gives me a lot of insight into what Andrew might be thinking, if he agrees or disagrees. I'm getting a lot of information. My headset, of course, is there to dumb things down, so I'm not getting nearly everything about Andrew that is there. But it dumbs things down when I look at this table to the point where I have no notion of intention or beliefs or anything. I mean, this is just a chunk of stuff. And when I get to a rock, there's nothing there. Does that mean that I'm dealing with something that's stupid? No, it means that my headset gave up. So this is a completely different way of thinking about things. The distinction between living and non-living is not principled. It's an artifact of the limitations of our headset. So in the trace logic point of view, I'm always dealing with consciousness, always. The only question is, does my headset give me how much insight does my headset give you into that consciousness that I'm interacting with? And so with the DMT questions, the question will now be, is DMT just screwing up the render? Right? That's one possibility. DMT is just screwing up the render. And so, and you know, if you hit me in the head, I get screwed up. So I can imagine DMT does the same thing. Or is it the case that the fidelity of my rendering of conscious agents goes up? And so all of a sudden, things that were before might have been inanimate, for example, are now rendered in a way where I actually see agency. So it's really the question of, is my headset being upgraded so that those icons that are rendering are giving me genuine access to consciousness outside, or am I just screwing up the render? That's the real question that we're going to be asking here. You can see, but notice this very way of positing things could not even be posited in the physicalist framework. This is not, you can't even think this scientific kind of story in the physicalist framework. You have to actually come to a completely different scientific point of view to even ask this kind of question.
Yeah, this is something that I had to wrestle with, is that the boundary, as Don said, between what we referred to in our paper as the agentic versus non-agentic dynamics. So in other words, which things appear as agents and which things don't appear as agents. And there's no fundamental ontological difference there. As Niffer drummed into my head, all perception is interacting with the conscious agent network. You're always in some way, you never have direct access to another agent's internal dynamics. They leave these traces. They influence through the perception kernel, they influence what's going on in your interface, and your brain renders that. So your brain, your consciousness, it's hard to kill that habit. But yeah, your interface renders that in some adaptive way, and sometimes it doesn't make any sense for it to render it in, as agentic dynamics, and sometimes it does. But there's no fundamental difference there. It also means that there's no fundamental difference between a hallucination and a veridical perception in some ways. Like, how do you distinguish between something that's real and something that's not real? And that's really difficult one to get your head around. But I think we're going to get to next. That doesn't mean, if me and Don both take DMT, as we're about to at the end, right, and we're interacting in some way, with, in a similar way with the conscious agent network, there should be some kind of correlation, perhaps, between our experience, in the same way that when we're in normal waking consciousness. I can talk about Carl's T-shirt that says "Feed me weird things," and Don would agree, yes, it says "Feed me weird things." I don't know those weird things are, but weird things, right? So just because we have different interfaces doesn't mean there aren't correlations. Just doesn't mean we can't look for correlations. And the same thing applies in the DMT state. We can still do science. We can still ask the question, when two people are taking DMT, is there some kind of shared aspects? Is there some kind of correlation that we can test for and that we can analyze?
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to empirical experiments. What would we like to do, to test predictions of this model? So, Andrew, maybe you can walk us through extended state DMT, DMT-X as it's called, and then some of the initial experiments you might have in mind.
Sure.
To do.
Yeah. So DMT-X, which I developed with Rick Strassman back in 2016, the idea was that the DMT experience is a very brief experience. It's a few minutes. Because it goes into the brain, it rises to a very high concentration very, very quickly, within seconds, and then almost, within a minute or so, it starts to come down. You get this exponential drop-off, and you stay within the DMT space, normally for a few minutes. The actual peak, the actual time within the kind of the breakthrough state is actually only 3, 4, 5 minutes. It's very, very quick. And the problem with that, of course, it's a blessing, let's face it. For most people, it's more than enough. But if you really want to do experiments within the space, you want to spend time interacting with the intelligences, the conscious agents, perhaps, within the space, then you need much more time. You need to be able to kind of stabilize the DMT level in the brain. And so with Rick Strassman, we developed this model which has come to be called DMT-X. We initially called it extended state DMT, which uses a technique from anesthesiology called target controlled intravenous infusion, which they use to maintain a relatively stable brain concentration of an anesthetic drug, short-acting anesthetic drug during surgery, so that the anesthesiologist can kind of keep you within the anesthetized state and actually manipulate that in real time. And it occurred to me that DMT has all of the kind of the requisite pharmacological properties that would make it, which would mean that we can basically replace the anesthetic drug with DMT. That's basically DMT-X. We can stabilize the brain DMT levels and induce somebody into the DMT state and hold them there. And that opens up an entirely new frontier for scientific research, because it's like going from scuba diving to deep sea diving when you've got a line to the boat. You can go a lot deeper, and you can spend a lot more time down there. In the same way, you can go into the DMT space and you can spend as much time as you like. So that then means that we can induce people into the DMT state and actually have them perform experiments. I'll describe briefly the kind of the two broad types of experiments that we might want to do. The first one is the simplest one, which is simply to test for these shared correlations, right? For example, can we have somebody retrieve information from the DMT state or from an entity that has been deposited by somebody else? So can somebody have a random number generated, and they take that into the DMT space, isolate it from the other participant, and they transmit that information into the DMT space. And then the other person comes along a little bit later and goes into the DMT space and retrieves that. There are people that often couples who claim to be able to interact with the same kind of entity. These are the kind of people we want. I think we're moving away from simply recruiting people because they've had some experience with psychedelics to actually recruiting individuals with specific skills. So there's kind of that's kind of the first type of experiment broadly. Then you have what I think is slightly more difficult, and you need more specialist individuals, is to actually look at, I said before that these beings often, they occupy this higher dimensional space. It has highly exotic and unusual geometries and topologies. Most people go in there and just go, fuck, that was ridiculous, right? That was impossible. And that's not very interesting scientifically. But if you can send in a geometer, or a topologist, or somebody who has mathematical sophistication, they can go into the space and they can say, oh, actually this is a 9-dimensional manifold. Yeah, that'll do. And can actually map out the symmetry groups. And I know, we're all indebted, I think, to the work of Andres Gomez Emilson, who I think is the pioneer in this. Somebody who is mathematically sophisticated. I know NIFA is working with Andres as well, and can go into the space and say, actually, the DMT space is very, very strange. It's very different to normal waking consciousness, and this is why. Right? We're going from a 3+1 dimensional space into this entirely different geometric and topological structure, and we can actually map the change. We can say what's actually happened to consciousness here, and then we can feed this back to the conscious realism model, the trace logic, and actually say, okay, what has DMT done? How has it affected the conscious agent in order to go from this state into this state? And so it's a feedback process. You have the experiments feed back into the model, and the model then gives us deeper and deeper insights into what DMT is actually doing. And we can also study, for example, how these beings are manipulating the space. Often they will, as I said, presenting these impossible higher dimensional objects. What are they actually doing here? Mathematically, what are they doing here? So broadly, I guess you could say we have a kind of ontological testing, looking for shared correlations to kind of prove the externality, if you like, of the space. And then we have the kind of the mapping of the structure, the dynamics, the topology, the geometry of the space, trying to understand how we're getting to the space in terms of the conscious agent dynamics.
What were so we're talking about Andres Gomez Emilson of the Qualia Research Institute, common collaborator for our groups, but he talked about some remarkable operations that entities can do within that space in terms of coloring, geometries and such. Can you talk a bit about what those are?
Yeah, so this is fascinating. So Andres told me that he often sees these entities doing coloring surfaces, which doesn't sound particularly impressive on its own. But these surfaces are mathematically, they are maps. So you have lots of shapes, all fully tessellated. And what these entities are doing is coloring the surfaces in 4 colors. And that's significant to the mathematicians in the room because there's something called the 4-color theorem, which basically says that it doesn't matter how complicated of a map of shapes you have, you can always color them with 4 colors so that no 2 colors abut each other. So there's no adjacent ones. It's obviously connected to maps of the world. You can color a map of the world in 4 colors, and no 2 countries will connect with the same color. And you can do that for any kind of map, even the most complicated ones. However, it's extremely difficult cognitively and demanding to do that without some computational algorithm that'll do it for you. You can't. You will take. Andres is as smart as they get, and he said it will take him maybe an hour or something to do this kind of thing, to color these maps. And yet these entities, they will color these exquisitely complex surfaces in more than 2 dimensions, and then wipe it, and then do it again, and then do it again, as if they're kind of trying to demonstrate, to show us, not that they necessarily expect us to fully understand, but just to show us that they can do things that that our brain cannot do. I mean, that's really, I think, what we're testing for. Do these entities have abilities, dynamical abilities, geometric abilities, topological abilities, mathematical abilities that are that go beyond the reach of the human brain? Because that would be another test. That's another beautiful test. If you can show that, if you send in 5, 6, 7 mathematicians and they all say, yes, these entities were doing things that I can tell you right now, I couldn't do as a mathematician, even if you gave me a couple of hours, and they were doing it in a fraction of a second repeatedly, those kind of things. Most people would look at that and go, oh, that was amazing. But when you send a mathematician in there, they can tell you why it was so amazing. And not just amazing, but beyond human capabilities. And that's another beautiful test for their ontology, I think.
Yeah, that was a wonderful deep sea dive yourself. Thank you for going there. I'd like to zoom out slightly with Don to talk about how you think that these experiments are going to help to improve the trace logic and the recursive trace logic and whatever comes after that. What sorts of insights you think could help to better the models?
Yes, all of these experimental results force me to think about things I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And they push me around, which is really good. You need to be pushed around. And I'm being pushed around in a lot of ways. So one, disincarnated intelligences, these things don't seem to be restricted in the same way that we are to the physical bodies. And so actually that kind of thing from Andrew's work and related work, telepathic kinds of work and non-speaking autistics and things that they seem to be claiming that they can do, forced me to, just in the last 2 months, go back to the recursive trace logic and ask myself, how can I understand this? How can I understand the possibility of actually having telekinesis even happen? Is that even possible in the model? And when I looked at it, the mathematics said to me, Don, not only is it possible, it's the norm. And that was what stunned me. I'm still reeling from that. That's only like 2 or 3 weeks ago I figured this out. And it's just bizarre for me to realize that being embodied is the special case. So just to give an example of that, when I observe through my eyes and look visually, every window that I see, of all the possible observer windows that are out there, every one that I see has a restriction. It has to have a nose in it, right? Every observer window you ever see has a nose in it. So you can just ask the mathematical question, out of all the different possible observer windows that are out there, how many of them, what percentage of them have a nose in it? 0%. It's just that simple. And when I realized it's not deep, it's in your face, that embodiment is the trivial case. You can tell I'm still reeling from it because I've only had like 2 months to sort of adjust to this. But you got to follow the math, and so I'm dealing with. So it's actually I lose sleep at night over this stuff. And yet there's either something wrong with my math or there's something wrong with my assumptions about this stuff. And the math looks good. It's so simple. So yeah, it pushes me around, and so I'm really open when I listen to Andrew and I listen to. No, by the way, I'm open to a certain point, but of course I'm very, very hard. I'm a psychophysicist, so I do careful experiments in the lab, and I have had. I'm not going to mention any name, but I did have a Swami 25 years ago who came to my lab who claimed to have all sorts of powers, and he published a book with his experiments. And I looked at, and my graduate student was one of his followers, and he came to me through her, and I decided, okay, well, I looked at his experiments, and actually his experiments were poor, and I realized you could drive a truck through them, and there was just holes everywhere. So I said, I thought it'd be good for the graduate student to see this. It would be good. So I took her. We looked at all these different designs. I said, here's the holes, and I had her fix the holes. I had the Swami then come into the lab and redo his experiments the right way. I left the building because of the disbeliever effect, right? So I didn't want to affect it. So I left the building, and she ran the experiments, and we didn't have to do any statistics. He showed no ability on any trial. So for 25 years, I left it at that. I mean, I tested a Swami, who's a big deal, thousands of followers, hundreds of tapes, and my experiment said 0, absolutely 0. But that's just one Swami. I mean, that doesn't mean that this is not true. It just means that that Swami on that day could not do it. And so I'm very, very hard-nosed about the experiments, but then when I get clean data, then I get pushed around. And my theory gets pushed around, and I, as a scientist, get pushed around. So that's you can see it's a fine line for a scientist. You have to be really hard-nosed so that you don't get pulled into stuff that's nonsense. And you can't be so hard-nosed that you miss the stuff that's real. And that's the fine line that I'm walking. And it's a very personal experience, I mean, for me. The mathematics also comes and slaps me in the face and says, discarnate intelligence is the norm. Well, I wouldn't have believed that 3 months ago. And now here I am saying it 3 months later because I got slapped in the face by my own math. So this is quite a learning experience. But the kind of work that I'm doing with Andrew and that I plan to start, I'm actually now starting to take a mind sight class just to see what it's like, see what that kind of stuff is, trying to see what you can do in terms of seeing stuff with blindfolds on. So again, in normal scientific studies, absolutely not possible, just not possible. No eyes, closed vision, not possible. When I look at our mathematics, it's saying it's possible, which doesn't mean that everybody who claims that they're doing it is doing it. My guess is that 99% of them are not doing it. But if there's 1% that are doing it, I've got to understand that 1%, right? All you need to prove that not all ravens are black, all you need is one white raven. That's all you need. And there may be many claims of white ravens that are false, but all you need is one true claim. And so that's my attitude. Most of it will probably be debunked, but if one piece is not debunked, then I have to change my theory. So,
Thank you. We might have time for a few questions, but before we do so, Andrew, a few closing remarks on the broader implications of this.
Yeah, I think the implications of Don's work and of DMT are hard to overstate. I've said for many years now that the definitive demonstration that not only are there beings, intelligent beings, conscious beings that exist within reality that we normally are unaware of, not only that, but that we, using one of the simplest alkaloids on the planet, this ubiquitous plant-derived alkaloid, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, that we can access these intelligences at will. The most common and I would say the most democratic of all psychedelic drugs, and then it's everywhere. On pretty much every continent you could find a plant that contains reasonable levels of DMT. The implications of that we can actually, not that they're just there, that we can actually interact with them, communicate with them, establish relationships with them, as the shamans, indigenous peoples have been doing for thousands of years, and we've been telling them that they're deluding themselves, that they're primitive, that they're barbaric, and that this is just nonsense, absolute utter nonsense. And now people like myself and Don are actually saying maybe we were a bit too quick to dismiss these experiences, and perhaps they have been interacting with beings that are normally imperceptible for thousands of years, and we're kind of as scientists in the Western world just about starting to catch up. And to be able to say, actually, you've been vindicated, and we're sorry about that.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Don. We have time for a few questions for anyone so inclined. I think we'll have a circulating microphone. Could you please pass that to this gentleman right here in the front?
Hi, thanks a lot. I have a question regarding sort of I'm curious about more possible standards that would allow you to satisfy that something is actually an ontologically distinct entity. But the one that you presented here was that it can do, mathematical operations that are very non-trivial, and especially in the time that they're doing them. And I'm wondering, the only problem I have with that standard is that if the point of comparison is another agent, like me I'm not a mathematician. Let's say if I were a mathematician, it would take me, some non-trivial amount of time to do that mapping problem, right? Paint the different colors. But by the same notion, like, it would take me a non-trivial amount of time to do a complex Fourier transform. It might take me a non-trivial amount of time to do certain kinds of rotation, to do the MNIST labeling problem that's done by neural networks or something along those lines. And yet, sub-agentic systems of myself, such as my auditory cortex, in fact, even just the hair cells before I even get to the auditory cortex, can do fast Fourier transforms very quickly on the order of milliseconds, and can do labeling problems. You can model a single cortical microcolumn. It can do the labeling problem, and we have millions of those. So comparing what I can do as the hyper agent to what the sub-agentic part can do, do you see what I mean? It's like it's a computationally non-trivial thing happening at an ostensible simple system. So how is that a satisfaction condition for something being an ontologically separate agent at my scale or even higher?
Yeah, I think
not that I disagree. It's just
no. It's a good pushback, and I think first of all, what we don't know, what we can't say, I can't say, you can't say, is that you are a single conscious agent. We think of ourselves as a single conscious agent.
We're definitely nested,
these sub-agents, right? And Don would say there's all these, you trace down and you have all these sub-agents, and we are not ontologically distinct from other agents. And so it's a very, you enter this weird territory where we're used to living in a world where we can, this is the self, this is the other, we can make this clear distinction, and it's very easy to kind of test something that I did or that I didn't do. But once you get into conscious realism, all of that boundary starts to blur. This is why in the paper we make the point is we're not looking for one single kind of mic drop experiment that finally proves that machine elves are real or anything like that. Is we're proposing a kind of suite of experiments that I think we're kind of almost getting away from, are they real or are they not real? And we're simply saying, okay, let's assume that conscious realism is in some sense correct. How does it all fit together? What is DMT doing? I think, again, within conscious realism, the distinction between the real and the unreal also seems to fall apart, because everything is consciousness, everything is conscious agent. So what does it even mean for it to be a hallucination? That starts to not kind of make sense. And so it's like we're getting away from, we're not trying to cop out of that question, but we're trying to understand, ultimately, we forget about the real versus non-real question. We're trying to say, okay, how does DMT affect how we interact with the conscious agent network? Is it some kind of sub-agents that is performing this? Maybe. Do we need to interact with some other agent with more complex Markovian dynamics that can perform it? Maybe, it's some kind of interaction between all of those things. That's a better question, I think, basically, rather than is it real or is it not real?
right. And maybe it's some hierarchy collapse where you can interact with hyperagents above you and sub-agents on the same scale, some kind of Saturnalia or something.
Got it.
Anyway.
But also I would say that you might also think, is the DMT space a communication channel? So could I put one person into the DMT space, have them say something in the space, have someone in our channel or space-time channel have no communication, but they get it through the so that would then show that there's some real communication information in that channel that's outside of space-time. That would, I think, get most scientists at least to pay attention.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Who wants to be next? Please go ahead.
Hi, how are you guys?
Okay.
Andrew, thank you for the invite, and Don, thank you for your work. You're actually the first scientist I ever emailed to when I started doing the work I'm doing now a few years ago, so it feels like a full circle for me. I do have a question for you that might feel a little outdated, because I know you've touched on this point many, many times on many podcasts, and that's about the fundamental assumption of the basically zero chance that we're perceiving reality for what it is, right? So in your comparison between the desktop and what the machinery of the logic gates is doing under the hood, so to speak, there is, now I understand the whole asymptotic nature of it. It's like approaching zero means zero in mathematics, right? However, for functional reasons, the difference between mathematics and computation, something needs to be computed in a finite time. So, and I understand that the work that you're doing with the amplitahedron and things like this probably is where the rubber touches the road, right? But what is that moment of translation between what, in the comparison you give between what the logic gates are doing to then making the folder brown versus the folder green? Is that exactly what, so these kernels that, Andrew, you were talking about, was it decision, action, and experience, or observation?
Decision, action, perception.
Perception. So I guess my more specific question is are you treating that asymptotic 0% as the limit? And are all these experiences that each agent is having is at the limit? Or the limit would be kind of the observer, like the totality of all possible observations? Because the thing that I'm thinking about there is that, and this is already details that you don't need to touch on the question because I think it's going to take too long. But what I was thinking as Andrew was speaking is that are you treating the observation as a field mathematically? Are you treating it as an instance that aggregates to many instances that collect to what experience is? And then and also what is that distance between what you would call a decision and an action at the end of it, right? So those are the questions that kind of made me really question this whole, what is that thing that actually gives rise to this instance? But I guess the one question I really would like to hear you answer is the limit part. Like, each agent is riding on the limit, or is the totality of the limit is basically the ultimate observer or God or whatever you want to call it?
Well, in terms of when I say the certain, like, embodiment is measure zero, is that the kind of thing you're asking? What do I actually mean there when I say it's probability zero? That
you're saying there is no chance of perceiving reality for what it is. It's zero.
Oh, okay, so that's it. So you're referring to. So I have some different work that's completely unrelated to what we're talking about here about evolution, and I've worked on evolution by natural selection and with Chetan Prakash and others, and shown that evolution entails that the probability is zero that any organism has ever been shaped by evolution to see any aspect of reality as it is. So that's the claim that we've published mathematically. And the pushback that we get is that would be self-refuting, right? If you start off with evolution, Darwin's theory says that the world is a physical world. It's made of physical organisms competing for physical resources in space and time. And so if you use Darwin's mathematical model of Darwin's theory to show that his basic assumptions aren't true, then you've shot yourself in the foot logically, and you don't know what you're doing. You should go learn some basic science. And that whole objection is actually misunderstands the nature of science. We never assume in science that our assumptions are true. We only assume that they're consistent. All we need to do is assume that our assumptions are consistent. We know that our assumptions can never be the final word because we never explain our assumptions. We assume them. So someone can always try to build a deeper theory which tries to explain the assumptions that you started with. So science has infinite job security in principle because every theory never explains its assumptions. It always assumes that its assumptions are consistent, and then it will have a finite scope, so or at least a limited scope. Every scientific theory has a limited scope. A good theory gives you the tools to explore its scope. A great theory, like Einstein together with quantum theory, gives you the tools to find the limits of the assumptions that started the theory. So in Einstein's case with quantum field theory, we know that the tools of those theories, and those theories assume space and time as their foundation. And they then come back and tell you, based on our assumptions are not true at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. Our assumptions fall apart at the Planck scale. Those are great theories that start with assumptions and then go back and show you that those assumptions have a failure. And then they point you to a deeper point of frame. Now, what I'm saying about Darwin's theory is exactly, Darwin's theory with evolutionary game theory is not just a good theory, it's a great theory. It gives you the tools that come back and show you that the fundamental assumptions of space and time and physical objects that Darwin started with fail at a certain place. And we can go, I won't go into the technical details about why they fail, but they do fail, and you don't have to shoot yourself in the foot to do that. That's just the way science works. But it's amazing, I'll just say, brilliant philosophers have published in top-level journal attacks on this, misunderstanding. They say, if you have a scientific theory, you're assuming that the assumptions are true. You don't know your science. Scientists do not assume that their assumptions are true. We know that they're not. We know that at best they're consistent. And we're going to try to find out the failure conditions.
I don't want to take too much time, but I actually have no gripe whatsoever with that I understand it fully. My question was more technical around the instance of observation. That moment. So I guess let me ask it simply. So these kernels, these specifics of how they arrange in relationship to one another, would you say that that is what's responsible for the mechanics of what gives rise to a particular moment of consciousness versus any other? Those are the main operatives, or there's way more than that?
Well, so if we have the way to think about if you're interested in the instantaneous experiences and the sequence of those, then the way to think about that is well, first, the trace logic is a non-Boolean logic. Okay, so it's locally Boolean. So if I take one matrix that's a billion by a billion, and I look at all the subtraces of it, all those subtraces form a Boolean sublogic. So in that particular Boolean case, if I look at how the state is moving around on the big logic, then there will be a coordination of how it's moving around in every one of the traces. This is sort of like Leibniz's pre-established harmony idea within the monadology. So there's all these monads which are observers, and Leibniz said we need these monads, and we also need a pre-established harmony. I'm saying these observer windows are the monads, and the trace logic is the pre-established harmony that Leibniz was looking for. And on these Boolean sublogics, then your question is answered completely, because as I trace around on the big one, then everything in the Boolean sublogic gets nicely coordinated. And so this is also going to be the foundation for why we can have communication between scientists, how our observations can match, because on a Boolean sublogic you have meets, and so where you and I meet on the Boolean sublogic, we can exchange data as scientists and actually get comparison of data. So we get the objectivity of science. But the trace logic is non-Boolean more generally, so this is really quite interesting. There are going to be, our science is fine for our part of the trace logic. It's not going to be fine for experiences in other parts of the trace logic, because what we experience here has a different structure from what's outside in different parts. So what this means is that it's far more complicated than I had ever imagined. So my math always slaps me in the face.
Mm-hmm. I think when you imply instantaneous, you're kind of implying time, but time is part of the headset. So it's something that we need to derive, I think, from the trace logic itself. I think we have time for one more question. I'd like to ask the gentleman in back, and then the rest of you, apologies, but you can come up to Don and Andrew afterwards. Thank you.
Hey, this question is for Dr. Gallimore. I was thinking about your comments talking about being specific with who you recruit for your experiments these days, getting the most out of experimentation. And that was a part of your book that really resonated with me, where I believe your example was bringing linguistics, under DMTX, linguists under DMTX to see what we can derive from, what's being told by the machine elves. And I'm wondering, it sounds like, as you were expressing yourself today, that at least, some of your experiments are, around the quantitative, and at least some are oriented around just verifying, whether this is an actual alternate space to ours. And I'm wondering how you go about thinking beyond that. And in particular, what I'm thinking about is other valid yet unexplainable phenomena, such as the work being done at University of Virginia, looking at near-death experiences and the abilities that some survivors come back with, saying, the ability to connect in ways that ordinary people can't, derive knowledge, from, whether you want to call it the Akashic Records or whatnot, or the work done at Stanford Research Institute, looking at remote viewers. So in other words, those that are more connected in ways that normal people are, and designing experimentations around them to allow for serendipity in unexplored communicative avenues with the alternate reality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean the kind of the examples that I gave earlier was one very easy to understand example of shared, correlations between independent experiences. But as I said in the book, I think you're referring to Death by Astonishment, maybe. I have discussed many times that not just mathematicians, but yes, linguists, theologians, artists, people from all different disciplines. I often use the analogy of, you have this uncharted region of virgin rainforest, and you want to understand it, and you don't just send in random people because they've got a raincoat. You send in geologists and botanists and hydrologists and all of these types of people, and they're all charged with going in and extracting, retrieving and analyzing certain types of information. And I think the DMT space should be approached in the same way. It is largely uncharted territory. The difference, I think, from the rainforest is that we're dealing with something that is far, far stranger and vaster and much more difficult to grapple with intellectually, cognitively, and experientially, all of these things. And so, I see teams of people with specific skill sets, and they might be people who have worked on NDEs. It might be people who are trained in understanding ancient symbolism, someone who can look at these strange symbols that often appear in the DMT state, that often coat the surface, and say, okay, this looks like some kind of language in some way. Can we analyze it? Can we say, oh, this is not just random digits, but actually contains information. We have the tools now. Linguists have the tools to mathematically analyze these symbols and say, actually, this is not just the brain kind of generating symbols randomly, but actually there is something there. There's a message there, perhaps. Can we decode that message? It's a vast and very, very broad area of study, I think, that we're getting ourselves into here. We're not just looking for people to pull out the same digits, to pull out the same number or the same code word or whatever. We're looking for people from all these different disciplines to all go with specific tasks. And with the DMTX technology that was validated now at Imperial College London, we have subject 0, Carl Smith here, the first person to undergo DMTX at Imperial College London, and the only one to finish all 5 doses. Yeah, a round of applause.
Okay.
So we have this amazing tool, DMTX, if I may say so myself, that has been validated now, and we're dipping our toes in the water. And soon we're going to be diving down. We'll have the line to the boat, and we're going to be exploring territory and finding beings that we've never seen before, and communicating with them and trying to learn from them. As we learn from each other, and we effectively become not just interdimensional species or galactic citizens, but interdimensional citizens, who are routinely interacting with normally imperceptible beings and forming relationships with them. And that's going to be a remarkable time to be alive.
It's great. It's a remarkable time now. I would say, Andrew, as we close talking about research teams and about explorations and technologies, would you say a bit about the donation link?
Oh yes, we get to the money. So I was just talking about research, of course, but all research unfortunately takes money, and often quite a lot of it. We don't have much money. But the Trace Institute that Don mentioned, that Gaspard, who's here, has been instrumental in spearheading that and developing that. Raise your hand, Gaspard. No, he's too shy. Oh, there he is. Sorry. Yeah, a round of applause for Gaspard. And Gaspard and the Trace Institute team have been working very, very hard to build the website. So go to the Trace Institute website, traceinstitute.org. Trace Institute. Not the Trace, just traceinstitute.org. Traceinstitute.org, and you can find out all about the work that the Trace Institute wants to do, the kind of research. And that will take money. So anyone who's got deep pockets, get your checkbook out, that kind of thing. Also, I should mention, as Charles mentioned at the beginning, I work with Noonautics. We are a non-profit, and we are interested in this kind of research as well. We're interested in spearheading and developing research programs connected to psychedelics as well as some other things, but DMT in particular, the kind of research programs that I was discussing earlier today. And again, that needs money. So anyone who wants to support and be kind of on the ground floor level of what could be completely transcendentally transformative research, speak to us. And go to the Noonautics website as well, noonautics.org, NOONAUTICS.org.
Yes, I encourage you to support generously. So I'd like to close by thanking all of you in the live audience here today and online. I'd like to thank the Trace Institute and Noonautics organization for producing this great event. And most of all, let's give a warm round of applause to Andrew Gallimore and Donald Hoffman.
Thank you very much. I will say that I got to fly out to Vegas later this afternoon, so I'm happy to talk to people, but please, meet and greet is better than I'm collaring me for sort of 30 minutes, because I'd like to speak to people, but I've really only got probably 15 minutes or so after this, so give everyone the opportunity that wants to speak to me, and the same applies to Don. He might have more time than me, I'm not sure. Also, if anyone wants to do DMTX, we do have this research institute and retreat center in the Caribbean called Eleusis, and you can go to EleusisMind, ELEUSISMIND.com, and you can book yourself for a few-day retreat on this beautiful Caribbean island to undergo DMTX, multiple sessions with fully medically supervised and safe. And so yeah, anyone who wants to do DMTX, go to EleusisMind.com.
All right.
And I'm done.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for being with us today.